State education officials are moving to change the formula for expansion of charter schools. If the proposed change is adopted in its current form, the likely result will be less expansion of charter schools in urban communities such as Boston. The change is supported by the Boston Teachers Union, but there's opposition from operators of charter schools. One of them is our guest, the co-director of the Edward Brooke Charter Schools, Jon Clark. Thank you very much for being with us, Jon.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, this is not the change that many of us might have been expecting, because this is a regulatory change coming from the Board of Education. So how does this work exactly?
Right. Well, actually, this is kind of the latest chapter in a longer story that started with the legislation all the way back to 2009. The legislation I'm talking about was the 2010 Education Reform Act that lifted the caps on charter schools, but only lifted them in the lowest performing districts in the state, the bottom 10%. And at that time, there was some discussion about how do you determine what those bottom 10%, how we rank those bottom 10%. And there was consensus that we should do it by looking at overall achievement, MCAS achievement. But there were a few dissenting voices at the time that said, maybe we should rank schools according to their growth. And two senators, Pat Jalen from Somerville and Sonia Chang Diaz from Boston, introduced an amendment that would have ranked those bottom 10% by growth. And there was actually a big hullabaloo about it at the time. I think the Globe ran the story, and BUR, I think, did a story. But that amendment was kind of resoundingly defeated, because I think everybody realized the point of the legislation, which was called an act relative to the achievement gap, was to provide more high-quality options in districts where the achievement gaps were biggest and most persistent and affected the most number of families. And so now, fast forward to now, in March, Senator Jalen wrote a letter to the Board of Ed asking them to consider ranking schools by growth. So in that sense, it's kind of, it's an end run around the legislation that was passed in 2010, and that's where it is right now, and the Board of Ed is considering it.
Well, from one perspective, it does sound reasonable to mitigate the financial toll on district public schools if they're doing better, at least. But aside from that, though, why is this so bad for the parents who might prefer the charter school option?
Well, the practical effect, if the cap is not allowed to be lifted further, if those rankings are changed, the practical effect is schools like ours would not then be able to offer the opportunity that we're offering to more families. The over 4,000 families that are on our waiting list, and the 1,500 current Brooke families that want a high school for their kids. So that's the practical effect. But to answer your question about growth, growth it's not that we don't believe in looking at growth, and we're really excited about the way the state has started to measure growth using these student growth percentiles. But we just have to be really careful about how we use it. And the kind of growth that matters is gap closing growth. So in other words, if you're a school or a district in the bottom 10% in the entire state, we ought to be looking maybe as well at growth, but we only ought to be exempting you from that bottom 10% if your growth is gap closing. And that's not what we're doing right now. We're ranking schools by growth and saying, look, if you're not at the worst growers in the state, you get to come out of the bottom 10%. And that's upside down, I think, and most people recognize that. Is if you're in the bottom 10%, but your kids are making more growth than the rest of the state, yeah, then we ought to take a second look.
Well, right now, your schools are more or less in the elementary grade level, and you're looking to go to high school level. So I guess that makes a difference, because maybe there are families who like what they've experienced so far, and they want to go to a Brooke High School, I guess.
Yeah, no, absolutely. These are families who just desperately want a great education for their kids. And at our first campus in Roslindale, it's the highest performing K-8 school in the state. And our second and third schools, which are new, aren't at that same absolute level of performance, but they've got the highest SGP, or growth rate, in the state. And they want their kids to be able to continue to go to high school at Brooke.
I'm going to put you on the spot. What if you were the state education commissioner and you had to deal with this demand for more charter schools, and at the same time you want to limit the damage on district schools that are, doing better at least than they were in the past? What would you do about that?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I don't envy the commissioner. He has a tough job. Secondly, I guess I would contest a bit that the charters are doing damage to the districts. And I think we have the most generous district reimbursement program of anywhere in the country. When a student leaves to go to a charter school, for that first year, the district continues to get 100% of the tuition for that child, as if that child was still attending the district school. And then for 5 years thereafter, they continue to get 25% of that tuition. So I think that's a separate issue, and we can disagree on whether the reimbursement should be that generous or not. But that's a separate issue as to whether kind of the districts are being harmed. And the bottom line is we're in this to make sure that we close the achievement gap, and that all of our kids, doesn't matter if they're low income or black or Latino, have the opportunity to go to a great school and make everything out of themselves that they want to make out of themselves. And when we have more schools that can do that and can close that gap, then that ought to be our bottom line, is how many of those kids we're doing right by.
I guess it almost looks as if we need more money from the state for both kinds of public schools.
Certainly, I think more money makes some of these problems go away. I think if the state were able to fully fund those district reimbursements, I think that would make a lot of people happy. So yeah, I think money does solve problems in the short term anyway.
Thank you very much for being with us.
No, thanks for having me.
The Edward Brooke Charter Schools, Jon Clark. Still to come, surviving violence and the pain of crimes unsolved. But first, this message.